This episode of Metatrex is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
There's no greater challenge than the study of philosophy.
My philosophy is that there is room for all philosophies on this station.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 75 of Metatrex, Trek FM show on Star Trek and philosophy. My name is Zachary Fruehling, and with me as he always is Mike Morrison. Well, today we are going to be discussing a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a former educator and educational content developer. We are going to be talking about futuristic philosophy of education in the Star Trek universe. Mike, are you ready to get educated?
I'm actually tired, Zachary. I have been working on my pad today, working on my calculus homework. I'm a little fried personally, but I've got enough left in the tank, I think, to have a discussion about futuristic philosophy and education.
You were doing your homework on your space iPad?
On my pad, my personal access device.
We must be living in the future. Calculus? I learned that in grade school. What are you talking about?
Well,
everyone in the 24th century learns calculus in grade school. Everyone knows that.
I've been prepping for my Starfleet entry exam, and just trying to catch up.
Speaking of Starfleet entrance exams, before we get started, they have some pretty epic real life simulations on those Starfleet entrance exams.
Yeah, I've been prepping for that as well, spending some extra time in the holodeck. I hope that's believable, at least.
Practicing your CPR, dragging fallen comrades out of the smoking room. I hope you've been studying up on how to reprogram the Kobayashi Maru simulator while you're at it. That's an essential part of the Starfleet experience.
I always cheat death.
Well, as you can see, education in the Star Trek universe is actually a thing. People are born, they grow up, they go to Starfleet Academy, and they have to do all of the educational experience it takes to get there. So we thought it would be fun to talk about some of the things in the Star Trek universe that reveal what Star Trek's take on what futuristic education could be like. How do we get from the 21st century education experience to the 24th century education experience? And what are the qualitative differences and some of the tools and processes and views of education that really define what we see in the Star Trek universe?
There are not a lot of discussions out there about it, but actually within Star Trek, there's actually a pretty good glimpse into the educational system of the future, according to the Star Trek universe. And you're right, Zachary. We thought it would be a lot of fun to take a look at some of those episodes and some of those examples and just see what the Star Trek vision for, futuristic education, the philosophy of education might be. Because again, there are lots of examples within Star Trek that honestly, a lot of times would just get looked over. They're not the main focus at all of the episodes, but they're just these little windows, these little glimpses into the education of the future, according to Star Trek.
Yeah, we'll have to see what we can extrapolate, because I think you're right. This isn't something that's dwelled upon a lot in the Star Trek universe, but we do get to see a lot of little specific instances or concrete examples of education in action in the 24th century. It'll be fun and interesting to see what we can learn and discern about the overall view of education in the 24th century in the Star Trek universe from those few concrete examples we do see.
Yeah, I agree, but I do predict a lot of conjecture in this particular podcast.
You mean we're not going to have all the answers? How disappointing. You better just turn us off right now. Tune us out.
Because again,
we'll have some answers.
They're just small glimpses. There's no one single episode that's really dedicated to what education looks like in the future. There are just these little glimpses within episodes, almost minor plot points that are almost non-existent, and you can easily just kind of forget about them and move on to what the episode was about. But they're actually a lot of times very informative if you're really watching, if you're really paying attention, if you're listening to the dialogue and you see how it plays into the episode. They're actually, pretty solid little concrete nuggets of information that you get.
I think one overall broad brushstroke takeaway right off the bat is that Star Trek, even though we only see a few instances of education, Star Trek seems to take the view that education itself will get better over time, right? We will see children learning calculus. We will see improvements in educational technology, and that will be an important part of this progression towards the improved society we see in the Star Trek universe.
Well, if you can imagine the role that technology plays in the Star Trek universe, it would seem to me only logical to kind of ramp up the education, at least in terms of, we've already mentioned calculus, but when you think about, again, that role that technology plays in the future in the Star Trek universe. So you really have to start with the children younger and younger and younger. So it's no surprise that calculus is something that they learn when they're very young, and, they're very hands-on. They're doing, for instance, I'm thinking of the episode Rascals from The Next Generation. I mean, we're in a kind of this elementary classroom that has this incredible little computer lab right there inside when I was going to schools all those many years ago. I mean, we had a computer lab. I was in high school when we put that computer lab in, so it seems interesting to me that here's this, basically it's a kindergarten class almost, and you've got this incredible computer lab in their, at their fingertips within that episode. So it does occur to me that it would be at a very young age that, these advanced concepts that really play a major role in technology would be introduced to children at a very, very young age.
But even though education has gone a little high-tech in the Star Trek universe with computer labs, like you mentioned, they still do have science experiments that consist of radishes growing up in special dirt, growing up kind of weird.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
I think you're hitting on a fundamental question, Mike, about the purpose of education in general, and this is a question we're facing in the educational world today. As technology gets more and more immersed in the educational experience of young people, people who grow up with iPhones and iPads and learning to program in Minecraft on their computers in kindergarten, these are common experiences for people across the board now in education. But the question I have is, what role should education play in regard to this? Should we be getting young people on a very technological track early on, because we know that's where jobs are going to be, and we know that those are the skills of the future? Or are we doing them a disservice by forcing that degree of specialization on them from the get-go, from preschool and kindergarten and first and second grade, really young kids? Do we want them growing up with kind of a programmer's mindset with all of those skills? Or do we try to encourage more of a liberal arts, generalist, multifaceted educational experience where, yes, technology is a part of the experience, but isn't a defining feature of the experience necessarily? And you can kind of see the pull, right? The more you focus on technology, because those are the skills of the future, the less you're focusing on the rest of the human experience. And the extent to which you're focusing on the rest of the human experience, the history and the arts and the literature and, pick your favorite, liberal arts kind of genre, the extent to which you focus on that is the extent to which you're almost not preparing people for actual jobs with actual technical skills.
It's funny you should mention that, because most of the examples obviously within the Star Trek universe involve, this concept of preparing children for Starfleet Academy. But we know from The Next Generation, for instance, that only a very small percentage of young people who apply to the academy and take the entrance exam ever get to fulfill that dream of being a part of Starfleet, at least in terms of going to the academy and being an officer. And
it's like going to Oxford or Cambridge or something. Like, very few people get to do that.
Yeah.
It's real. They really make it out to be almost an elitist kind of concept in some areas, as opposed to, Star Trek's overall view is it's very democratic, very pluralistic, very inclusive. But in terms of Starfleet Academy, they do try to create the impression that it's a very elite class of people that get the opportunity to go to Starfleet Academy.
Yes, and so for the guy who didn't quite make the cut and get in. I mean, for instance, Wesley goes to, take the exam with, I think 4 or 5 other students, and they were only going to take one of those students from that group. So if you say, well, that's the way it is, 1 in 5 who apply get accepted. Let's just use that as a ratio. What happens to the other 4 students? How do they fulfill their Starfleet hopes and dreams? Do they enlist?
They become archaeologists.
Well, they can enlist like Miles O'Brien. They can become an enlisted person. And then, of course, the one example that we get really of a non-Starfleet education would be Jake from Deep Space Nine, who applied to a special writing school. He got a fellowship at a writing school in New Zealand. And so at least we know that, there are other means of gaining an education and fulfilling your dreams. But we don't see it a lot in the Star Trek universe. So I would imagine that people in the future in the Star Trek universe, they have to decide what their career path is, and then there are specialized schools to help them achieve their goals if they're good enough in that field.
Yeah, you make an interesting point that in the Star Trek universe, we don't really get to see civilian life or civilian education very much. Everything we see is through the lens of Starfleet, right? So, I mean, in lots of places in the Star Trek universe, we see kind of references to civilian life. Like, I'm thinking of the episode Family, where Captain Picard is being offered a position to go, work under the ocean and raise a new subcontinent with his friend Lewis, right? Well, if they're building a subcontinent, that needs engineers and marine biologists, and these are civilian people. This doesn't seem like a Starfleet project. So there's an entire educational career track, multiple career tracks and multiple educational experiences outside of Starfleet that we only really get the tiniest glimpse of inside the Star Trek universe.
But what fascinates me about that particular example, Zachary, and that's a great example, I'm glad you mentioned that, is that what made Jean-Luc Picard such an attractive applicant or such an attractive candidate for that position was his Starfleet training and experience.
Generally, I think that's what we see here in the real world too, right? People who've been in the military bring a certain skill set. They bring discipline, they bring team building skills, they bring work ethic, and those are attractive qualities to a prospective employer. So former military experience, obviously makes a candidate, puts you have a certain degree of reliability in what that person brings to the table, I would say, right? They go, oh yeah, we can depend on this person because he's got all the training and the experience that shows he can be a dependable person. But I do also think that it's interesting that we see a Starfleet educational experience more or less, because that forces you to specialize, right? If you're going to be running a starship, you do need tactical skills. You need to know how to drive the ship. You need to know how to maintain it and, take care of the warp core and all the things that, go into the starship operations. And we see that Wesley Crusher's educational experience has largely been about starship operations and the related technologies and science associated with that, right? He's not had the broadest experience necessarily. Although we do see once he gets to the academy, I think it's fascinating that he's learning Latin at Starfleet Academy, because that shows that even in Starfleet, they recognize that there's more to the human experience than starship operations. And Wesley admits as much when he, comes back aboard the Enterprise after his first year at Starfleet Academy. But the conversation that comes to my mind is Captain Picard's conversation with Wesley in the shuttlecraft in Samaritan Snare. And if you remember, Wesley's about to take his Starfleet entrance exam, and he's got a lot in his mind, and Captain Picard asks him, did you read that book I gave you some time ago? And it was William James, speaking of, philosophy of education, right? And Wesley says, oh, no, I haven't got that far. I'm sorry. And William James isn't going to be on the exam anyway, so I just didn't prioritize it. And Captain Picard wisely says, the most important things never will be on the exam. And I think that's so true. Almost no matter what you're studying in school, the important lessons that you take away are largely experiential, and they revolve around the human human experience in a way that no exam, no classroom, no course you take will ever be able to fully capture. And unless you actively seek out those broader experiences, you are depriving yourself of a portion of the human experience.
I remember sitting in an interview one time for a job many, many years ago, and the gentleman that I was interviewing with informed me that that college degree meant little or nothing in light of what I was getting myself into if I were to come aboard within his organization. And basically what he was saying to me was that the experience that I was going to gain by working for his company would far outweigh in terms of the benefits of my college education, that the college classroom had not prepared me for what I was going to experience in the workplace. And I found that to be true in many, many ways, although I must say that what I gained by going to college, by the coursework and even the social experiences. I mean, there's so much more about going to college than just sitting in a classroom. It's the social experience. It's for many young people, it's the first time that they've been out from underneath mom and dad's roof, so they're learning critical life skills that they're going to need in the future. They're still students and they have an opportunity to fail, but really for the first time they're having to do their own laundry, they're having to manage their own checking account and so on and so forth. So these are life skills that go even beyond the classroom. So I think that's an important thing that I think we see within Star Trek too, because, in the case of Nog and certainly in the case of Wesley Crusher, they're having to feel their way around a different experience, a different atmosphere, and they're having to figure out complex social situations and how to get in with Red Squad. And so there's so much more going on in these educational experiences that we see within the Star Trek universe that goes beyond the classroom. And I think that's interesting because, it's art imitating life, because, for many people, it's not the challenge of the classroom. It's the challenge of being out on your own and trying to navigate your way through these kind of interesting, complex life situations.
Well, it's funny you mentioned life skills. There's a phrase that's going around in the popular educational and practical vernacular, and you've heard it. I guarantee you've heard it. Most of you listeners have probably heard it. Life hacking. Mm-hmm. Right? Taking skills and tools and technologies and sort of improving the workflow of your life, solving problems in your life and whatnot. Life hacking, right?
Another is adulting.
Yeah, sure.
Adulting. I mean, we talk about adulting. These are kids going out there learning how to be adults.
But I guess I kind of worry about the hidden assumptions that this technological education has brought to our mindset about the human experience and what our goals should be. A lot of the human experience is undefinable, right? For example, I just had a birthday this week. I'm 39 now, and I was 38 last time we recorded an episode of Metatreks. And I'm creeping up on age 40. And that has got me thinking that the days behind me might be more than the days ahead, if not now, then some short number of years down the road, I'll be past the midway point of life, right? And that creates this existential anxiety. Like, what is the purpose of life? What do I want to accomplish? What should my goals and priorities be? What does it all mean? And that creates an internal anxiety for me, who likes to think about such things. And that's not something you can life hack away, right? You can distract yourself and not think about it. You can buy a race car, or if you're in the 24th century, you can, soup up your shuttlecraft, build a faster Delta Flyer and Voyager, right? Like Tom Paris. You can distract yourself from these things, but that's not the same as actually dealing with them. So I guess I worry that, this kind of technological mindset, this problem-solving mindset, for lack of a better word, that we're trying to encourage young people to foster. That if you have a problem, you break it down into its components, and you see what tools you've got, and you go finding your resources, and you put all those things together, and you solve the problem. That is such a practical skill, and it's important to learn those things, right? If you don't learn those skills, you won't actually be able to problem solve, and you can't deal with the practical things that come in life, whether in day-to-day life or in a career. But I worry that creates this mindset that any problem you face, any existential anxiety, anything that you don't understand, you can life hack away if you just get a few more skills or get the right resources or work at it a little harder. I think it's important to dwell on the existential anxiety that comes with thinking about philosophy and dwelling on the meaning of life and the human experience, and this kind of forced technological specialization that we're kind of promoting, like, oh, everyone should learn to program because, that will get you a good job someday. And, oh, programmers are great at problem solving because, they can break it down into its components and they can, think of problems in terms of a series of steps. And logic teachers, I used to be a logic teacher. Logic teachers are really good at this, right? Oh, you need to get to a conclusion. You just start with some premises, you deduce all the things that follow, and boom, you reach your conclusion. It's all very deterministic and predictable and programmatic, and there's an answer at the end of the day, right? You solve the problem or you reach the conclusion, whatever it is. I just worry that the important things of human life are not like that. So we're kind of doing people a disservice when we're promoting quite so much life hacking. And in the 24th century in Star Trek, there's so much life hacking, right? You've got replicators and space iPads, and you've got all the simulated educational experiences on the holodeck, anything that looks like it's a solvable problem inside the Star Trek universe. So it takes someone like Captain Picard, who's older and going through the same thought process I'm going through right now, which is what does it all mean at the midway point through life, to say, slow down, just because it's not on the exam doesn't mean it's not important. And the really challenging things are things like philosophy, things like dwelling on the meaning of life, these bigger, broader questions that only philosophy really deals with adequately. And those things you can't capture in an exam. So what does that mean for us today? Of course, you can criticize the educational world all you like and say, well, it's important for education to capture this. But I think it's just worth reminding. I think there's just a danger of forgetting the things that are really important about human life in our attempt to be as practical and problem solving as possible.
Zachary, you said a number of things there that I thought were rather fascinating, and I'm probably my subspace is probably going to blow up with hate mail when I say this, but I'm a big fan of Mike Rowe. Mike Rowe is the Dirty Jobs guy.
Oh, the Dirty Jobs guy.
The Dirty Jobs guy. I'm a big fan of his, and one of the things that he has criticized to some degree is this, this push to, send our young people off to university and with a focus, with an emphasis on technology. And what's actually being ignored oftentimes are the hands-on dirty jobs out there, the jobs that require, mechanical aptitudes and so on and so forth. You and I were talking in the Turbolift about welding. I had a job when I was doing an internship, and I actually got the job because I fibbed a little bit and said that I knew something about welding. And I got a job as a spot welder at a manufacturing facility at night while I was doing my internship. And that led to working in another department, building the foam insulated doors on the inside of vending machines, and these jobs sometimes are in high demand because there just aren't enough people to fill those positions because the emphasis is on technology. And I think that's really interesting. So, I got to wonder, in the future, if all of the emphasis is on technology, who do we get to scrub
the plasma manifolds?
The plasma manifolds. So, we have this, when I was growing up, my mother used to say to me all the time, Mike, you can be anything you want to be if you just apply yourself. And I think it's true to some degree. And I don't want to downplay the hard work that goes into making ourselves better, to better ourselves. Sometimes that's hard work, and sometimes those life hacks, they really do make a difference. And I'm a big proponent of hard work, by the way. I've worked since I was old enough to literally push a lawnmower. 8 years old, I'm pushing a lawnmower. I'm mowing 2, 3, 4 yards a week. Making $20 a week mowing yards. I mean, when I was growing up, I literally did anything and everything. Picked up trash. I mean, shovel snow. You can't even find kids that shovel snow these days. I know I sound like an old geezer when I say that, but when I was a kid, if the snow fell, you went out and you made $5 shoveling snow. And so I'm a big believer in hard work. And I don't want to downplay the hard work that goes into bettering ourselves either, because, hey, I've been there. I went to college, and that can be hard work. And you're in the classroom. A lot of times you're working, in my case, 2 part-time jobs, trying to, keep the money coming in, the credits coming in so that you can afford next semester. So, I've been there, and that's hard work as well. But, I think there's something to be said for hard work, and not everybody can be anything that they want to be when they grow up. And I think to some degree, Zachary, if there's this big push to get kids into the technology sector, I have to wonder, as I sit here, what areas of our everyday life, what jobs out there are going to suffer, what part of our lives are going to be impacted because there aren't qualified candidates who, can do, dirty job A, B, or C.
It's funny, Mike, that you mentioned this kind of hardworking work ethic. I've been accused of being a workaholic. Anyone that knows me has at one point thought of me as a workaholic. and partly it's because I learned early on, really young. I learned, before I was 10 years old, that I could do tasks for people, jobs, and people would pay me money. Mm-hmm. And if I had money, I could get the things I want. And I learned that early, right? So as I grew up, I continued doing that. I mean, from the moment I could get a job, I was able to do it. I was a barista. Then I did some construction for a couple of summers for my uncle. Then I did sales at Radio Shack, some other practical jobs that, I won't go into, but I had a number of practical jobs, and then I became an academic. So then I became a philosophy teacher, and then I worked in educational content development. And each one of those jobs has kind of had its pros and its cons. The very practical jobs don't do much to stimulate your broader thinking about life, I think, honestly. Right? They're very task oriented. Get the thing done, mm-hmm. so you can get the task done, so you can get your paycheck, so you can move on with the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. And it's very rewarding to complete a task. And I think this speaks to something of the difference between extrinsic rewards of education and intrinsic rewards of education, right? The extrinsic rewards are the external things, like the paycheck, the benefits you get, the things you can buy with your paycheck, the benefits that come with, maintaining a certain quality of life, right? Those are kind of extrinsic rewards, the material rewards that you get for doing your work. And then there's the intrinsic rewards. And I think hard work, working at a practical task is intrinsically valuable. It does feel intrinsically good to complete a task. It's good in itself, right? And the same question can be asked of these broader educational experiences, asking these deeper questions about human life, right? The existential dilemmas, the philosophical questions. Do those have extrinsic rewards? Not really. It's hard to imagine what that would be, right? I've managed to find the angle a couple of times. I went from being a philosophy teacher to getting a job working, getting paid to write educational content, right? That was an intrinsic reward. That was an extrinsic reward, right? I managed to kind of find the angle and navigate career-wise and find a way to take the body of knowledge I had learned and turn it into something practical. But there's something intrinsically valuable about asking philosophical questions and asking about the meaning of your own life. And that's not something you can capture in terms of costs and benefits and rewards and material remuneration, right? I guess a fundamental question I have is, in our emphasis on extrinsic rewards, giving students educational experiences that we know will lead to better income so they can maintain a certain quality of life, are we focusing on those extrinsic rewards to the detriment of the things that are intrinsically valuable, whether about abstract philosophical reflection, like we've been talking about trying to encourage, or even the intrinsic value of doing hardworking tasks? I think we underemphasize the intrinsic rewards, even of the practical tasks that we're teaching people to do. We're teaching people so much to focus on life hacking and problem solving and getting the extrinsic rewards, maximizing the return for your investment of time and resources, that we're forgetting that there's just something intrinsically valuable about doing a good job, no matter what you're doing.
You know, it's funny hearing you talk about, working for a construction company. You and I have so many things in common. It was beyond, both the fact that both of us have worked for Radio Shack. I worked on the side for a roofing company, and I literally cleaned up shingles and carried shingles up ladders.
Yeah. I've dangled off a roof from a rope.
Yeah,
absolutely,
exactly.
Nailing that plywood on a. My uncle used to build custom homes, like big fancy custom homes, and he liked grandiose homes, so he would build these really tall houses with really steep roofs, and I would literally take a 2x4, nail it to the top of a roof, figure out some way to anchor my rope to the top of this 2x4, and I would dangle very dangerously off the top of this roof so I could take this ginormous sheet of plywood, put it where it needed to be, hold it in place while I nail it there so it stays there while I try not to fall. Or imagine scaling up this enormous flimsy scaffolding to get to the top of the roof in the first place. I used to do these things. I can't even imagine doing those things now, but I totally did. And it was valuable. It was fun at the end of the day to go, look what we made with our own two hands. Isn't it awesome? And that was not an extrinsic reward. Yes, I got a paycheck. Yes, it came with certain benefits. Every job you do comes with certain benefits, right? But that was not what was valuable about it. It was intrinsically valuable at the end of the day to be able to go, look at what I did with my own two hands. And no matter what job you have, whether it's an academic job, whether it's a practical job, whether it's a dirty job like you described, whether you're sitting in the captain's chair on the Enterprise, or whether you're scrubbing plasma manifolds, there's something intrinsically valuable about just doing a good job at whatever task you're doing that day.
Yeah. It's funny as I look back on all the crazy things that I've done in my life and a lot of them, Zachary, were to make a buck. It was all about the remuneration. I mean, I'm a child of the 80s. So, for me, a lot of it was...
I shudder to think about what you did in the 80s for a buck.
But a lot of it was, I was born in 1970. So, growing up as a teenager in the 80s, it was all about getting that paycheck so I could go to Jeans West and buy a pair of button fly 501s. It's just that's the way it was. But I look back on these crazy experiences working in a grocery store. Before I went to college, I was a bag boy in a grocery store, and I was promoted to shift manager. I mean, literally the day I graduated from high school, I got a set of keys and I became a shift manager, for that little grocery store until I went off to college, and I worked summertime as an intern, and I worked for a beekeeper, to make money. So, I was out there in the beekeeping hood and, smoking the bees and putting the supers on and extracting honey. I did that. But the experiences and the way that it shaped my thinking and the things that I learned and the people that I met and, all of those composed, then those are the intrinsic things. And I look back on those and I look back on them fondly. But the thing that I think is interesting when we look at the future, I mean, we've taken that remuneration piece of it out. I mean, they're not getting a paycheck, so there really is a certain freedom there to be whatever they want to be, maybe in some cases be everything that they can be. So, I think that's a big difference. A lot of people will do a job to make a paycheck. I'll keep doing it because I need to get a paycheck. I'm kind of in that situation right now in my life. I'm kind of between jobs. I'm working, but I'm doing what I'm doing to make a paycheck right now. It's not about fulfilling any kind of, desire or passion that I have in life. And, I'm not doing anything to better myself. I don't really feel that I'm doing anything to enrich the lives of others, although you could probably argue that I am. But, for me right now, it's just it's the remuneration. I got bills to pay.
And it's interesting to ask the question about how that affects education in the 24th century, because here in the real world, I feel like something we haven't cracked in the educational world so much is how to get people to take ownership of whatever they do and take pride in their own work, no matter what they end up doing in life, right? You can't necessarily predict, at an early age what people are going to be doing, right? They could do any number of different career paths and things in life, but whatever it is, wherever you find yourself, whatever station in life, whatever job, whatever task you're doing, whatever hobby you've got, it's important to take pride in your work and try to do the best job at it you can. Take some ownership over it. And when you take that remuneration piece out of the puzzle, how does that affect the ownership over your work? Like for me, I had some very early formative experiences in these non-academic jobs that I think set a high bar for myself in terms of the kind of work that I produce. I remember a couple anecdotes in particular that I think would be helpful analogies. Like I remember we mentioned doing construction. I remember framing a wall with my uncle, building one of these custom homes. And I had not made it perfectly. Like I hadn't quite got the studs evenly spaced like they're supposed to be. Like one was a little crooked. I don't remember exactly what it was. And he came over and said, "You're going to have to redo that. That's not perfect enough yet." And I was like barely 14 years old or something. And I remember kind of asking, "But it's going to be hidden inside the wall. Is it going to fall down?" Like he's like, "That's not the point. The point is that if you need to take some pride in it. You need to be able to say, I made that and it's perfect." And that was a good lesson. And I remember something else when I was working as a barista in a coffee shop. My boss, John, who I don't know if he listens to this podcast, but if he does, John Spataco. I remember early on, probably my first week or two I was there, he asked me to go out and sweep the front of the cafe, like the sidewalk out in front. And I went out there and I swept, and he came out there to kind of inspect my work. And he pointed out the fact that there was still like some debris inside the cracks in the sidewalk. And I just remember like rolling my eyes going, "You've got to be kidding me. You want me to sweep the cracks in the sidewalk?" But that was such a good lesson. I mean, I'm still talking. I'm almost 40 years old now, and I'm still talking about this, right? Because it mattered, right? It was an important experience in learning that, okay, that was my job. My task was to clean the sidewalk. And I kind of did a half-assed job at it, right? I didn't do the best job I could. And it took someone else pointing it out, like, you didn't do as good of a job here as you could. Do it again until it's right. And so much of education is like that, right? Students do their work and they turn it in and you go, well, you didn't really hit a home run on this one. Here's your B- or here's your C+, whatever. I feel like too many times we don't set a high enough bar. We're not willing enough because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. Mainly, I think, it's good motivation. You don't want to hurt people's feelings. You want to kind of gently nudge them along. But too many times we're not willing to say, this is not good enough. You can do better. I know you can. I'm not going to accept it until you do a better job. And I think those early practical experiences gave me that kind of a mindset that I've carried with me no matter what jobs I had, whether it was teaching, whether it was content development, whatever I'm doing. I kind of set a high bar, and I disappoint myself every time I see myself producing something that I'm not 100% satisfied with. I go, man, I kind of blew it. And you can really kind of let yourself down in a way if you set too high of a bar for yourself. But I think too many people, I've observed students, I've observed this in work I've seen from other people. People are willing to settle for producing adequate, mediocre work instead of high quality, great work. And one thing I've just not yet figured out is how to get other people who don't already think of their work this way to take a higher degree of ownership in their own work. Like, they should look at their own work and go, is this good or is this crap? And if it's crap, they should keep working at it. Yeah. And it's hard because this is a tough nut to crack here in the real world. I don't know how to get other people who don't have that mindset to take that mindset. In education, of course, you can try to mold people. I think that for me, those practical experiences mattered more in cultivating that mindset than any of my educational academic experiences.
That is something that I love seeing in the Star Trek universe, because when we first meet Wesley Crusher, we assume that he's a student in a classroom. But Captain Picard sees something unique about him, something special about him, and he makes him an acting ensign. He brings him onto the bridge, and he begins to learn by touching and feeling and experiencing, what it is that, at least in Captain Picard's mind, in his mother's mind, and maybe even in his own mind at that time, this is going to be his future. He's got, his future is a Starfleet officer, maybe even a captain one of these days. And that's the path that he's going to follow. So now he's having this opportunity, Zachary, to learn by putting his hands on things, by experiencing things. In the 1800s, we had apprenticeships, and really we had apprenticeships in the 1950s, 1960s, and so few of them really exist today. But, once upon a time, apprenticeships were a big part of our educational system. We sent kids to the classroom for, X number of years, and then they entered into apprenticeships, and that's where they got, a lot of the practical experience. And that was for children that, weren't maybe of the aptitude to go off to a university somewhere. So I love that we see apprenticeships, at least in some degree, make a comeback in the 24th century.
Well, I think this is an interesting paradox of education. I think it's a truism and something I've learned over the years. And I always found this kind of intuitive, but you'd be surprised how many people don't think of education this way, that people learn best by doing, right? If there's a skill that they're supposed to learn, then you want students to actually be doing that thing rather than answering questions about that thing. And so much of the educational content that's out there, so much of the educational experiences revolves around reading about things, answering questions about things, rather than actually doing the things in question. Mm-hmm. And in this technological society that we're, kind of nudging our way towards in the 21st century into the 24th century, our ability to simulate real life experiences is getting greater, right? We have virtual reality now, and we have complex educational technology that lets you simulate almost whatever you want to simulate, right? You can set up a virtual operating table if you're studying to be a doctor. You can set up a virtual economy if you're studying to be an economist, and that is part of the educational experience now. To what extent does our ability to simulate, and I think this is something, I mean, in the 24th century, you've got the holodeck, you can simulate anything you want, right? Mm-hmm. To what extent does that ability, the educational technology and the ability to simulate, replace the need for a traditional apprenticeship? Like, they could have thrown Wesley in the holodeck and said, okay, go play on your fake starship in the holodeck, right? That would be kind of learning by doing, but that's not what Captain Picard does, right? He could have said, okay, we're going to set up a little mock classroom over there, down on deck 8, next to over there by the holodeck, where you can pop in there and you can play captain of a starship and do your Kobayashi Maru till the cows come home, and then you'll be ready for Starfleet Academy someday. But that's not what Captain Picard did, right? He sat Wesley at the helm of the actual Enterprise and gave him hands-on experience doing the things, right? And that was so much more valuable than any of the simulated experience he was getting. So it's, to me, in my mind, it's an interesting question where we have a greater and greater ability to approximate real life and actual doing in our educational technology and in our educational experiences as technology improves. On the other hand, those are still replacements for actual experience with real things that you can really touch that really matter. Right. And so are we doing students a service or a disservice by simulating reality versus having them do something more like an apprenticeship?
And I think that's a fascinating question. I think simulation only goes so far, though. And again, that's totally conjecture. That's just an opinion, based on a limited amount of information. But I think, again, in the Star Trek universe, yeah, they could have put him in a holodeck and let him Kobayashi Maru, as you said, till the cows come home. I mean, we kind of do that today. I mean, I play Star Trek Online. There's timelines. There's Trexels. I mean, there are lots of games out there.
You can run a fake Starship Captain experience. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you could have a
simulated, not fake, simulated.
Yeah, yeah, and I play Star Trek Online. I'm a vice admiral. I mean.
Well, I mean, there are these phrases that come up in education. They're buzzwords, right? One of these is gamification, like, giving people a game-like problem-solving educational experience that simulates or approximates something in real life. Students can learn to kind of game their way out of the problem and get some practical skills in the process. So sure, we can do that. Like, you can play Trexels and get, approximate the Starship Captain experience, but that's not as realistic and not as valuable as doing the real thing. You'd learn more from, a day serving on the actual Enterprise than all of the Trexel playing. On the other hand, I do think, things like educational technology are really good at some things. Like the content I used to write is logic content. Like if you're doing logic, you do Venn diagrams, you do logic proofs, right? And if you can get students actually doing those things, not simulate doing them, but actually doing the things using the technology, then that's technology at its best. If you're merely approximating or merely simulating, or if those are replacements for the actual doing, I would say that's probably less effective and less ideal.
I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that, and I hope, as I've talked, I hope I don't give the impression that I place little value on the classroom or on simulated experiences, because that's not the case at all. I think sometimes those are important confidence builders. I think that they're important building blocks, but when I say I'm so glad to see that apprenticeships, at least in some degree, make a comeback in the 24th century, that's only because I believe that those building blocks are important, but I think that the hands-on, doing, learning by doing, I don't think there's anything that can really replace that. And the experiences that I think Wesley Crusher got by actually sitting on the bridge and being a part of that decision-making process in the conference room, watching the Geordie PowerPoints and being able to throw his opinions in and present ideas. And I just don't think that there is a simulation out there that can replicate that to any real degree where there's really something on the line. The stakes are high.
Now I kind of picture Commander Riker walking over to the helm, and he says to Wesley, you did not degauss the cracks in the main deflector. Do it again until you get it right.
And when you're done, that deck plating better shine, mister, with your toothbrush.
Yeah. So it seems to me that education in the 24th century has additional challenges. On Deep Space Nine, when Keiko sets up her classroom, she has Federation children, she has Bajoran children, even Ferengi children, and they have a very multicultural melting pot in a microcosm inside Keiko's classroom. And this creates some tension in terms of the philosophy of education that goes on Deep Space Nine. I'm thinking of that episode in The Hands of the Prophets when Vedic Wynn is basically criticizing Keiko's teaching, putting forward this idea that the Bajoran children should be given a Bajoran spiritual education, whereas Keiko is trying to give a more multicultural, pluralistic / secular education based on Federation technology and Federation knowledge. And she kind of draws a distinction between, things that are culturally specific versus things that are universal that she wants to teach in her classroom. Mm-hmm. Or you could characterize it in terms of religion versus science, or you could characterize it in terms of cultural specificity versus universality. However you characterize it, I think in the 24th century, insofar as that is a melting pot that's analogous to the world we're in today, it's an interesting question. To what extent should education be multicultural and inclusive, and to what extent is education a normalizing experience?
I love it that you mentioned that episode, Zachary, and I think you raise an important point there about, kind of this culturalization. It's fascinating to me that is actually something that I think imitates what's going on out here in the real world. And that is, this problem that we have with, where to draw the lines in terms of presenting varying ideas in the classroom setting. For instance, I'm thinking of, creation versus evolution, being, one possible of many problems that you could present in the classroom, and what angle do you teach it from, and so on and so forth. And then you have this multicultural kind of setting that even goes broader than just atheist or Christian, and you have varying cultures. You have Ferengi students, you have Bajoran students, you have human students in this classroom. And we kind of tackled this issue, at least in terms of race, in the 1960s when we desegregated schools in the South, but we still have some of these kind of racial problems, at least here in the United States today, to the point that, here we are in 2017 and we have, schools that are primarily, for African American children or for Korean children or, for Muslim children. We have schools that are Christian faith-based. As a matter of fact, we sent our daughter for the first, 4 or 5 years of her education to a small private Christian school. And we were glad that she was able to get a quality education, a faith-based environment, because we felt that they were supporting, our worldview in addition to providing her an excellent education. So parents have choices here in the real world, but at least on Deep Space Nine, there was just the one school. It kind of reminded me of the type of school that you maybe would have had in the frontier. And I think that's interesting because Deep Space Nine kind of represented this futuristic frontier. So I don't think it's strange that we see a one-room classroom on Deep Space Nine with students of varying ages not just varying ages, but varying species as well.
I think it's a really fundamental question about early education in particular, but it does kind of filter up into the higher education as well. It's a question of whether the goal of education is to reinforce a specific set of values that I or we, whether it's an individual, whether it's a family, whether it's a community, whether it's a religion, that are already kind of agreed upon. Like, these are our values, so that's what we're going to teach in this educational environment, right? Or that's one view of education. That part of the goal of education, again, in addition to teaching like practical skills and teaching actual like knowledge, right? That part of the one role of education is to reinforce values, morals, or a worldview. But a competing view is that one goal of education is to expose people to a broader set of values, and almost like there's a marketplace of competing values and different worldviews. And that broader experience is part of a liberal education, right? You know, giving people access to different worldviews, different takes on things, and kind of letting people, as they mature, as they, are able to make judicious judgments about their own life and what they want to pursue and what their values are, and take some ownership over their own lives, that they'll have enough exposure to competing ideas that they can really kind of take some ownership over the process, rather than having those decisions made by old people who came before them. and it's an interesting, I think people just disagree about this, right? I think, if you come from a certain tradition or a certain faith or a certain worldview, it's understandable to want to reinforce that to the next generation and pass that on and make that part of the educational experience. I think that's a perfectly natural impulse. I wouldn't be criticizing that at all. On the other hand, it can be limiting. I have experienced firsthand, you've probably witnessed this firsthand, no need to give anecdotes here probably, but the danger of a narrow worldview when people see competing ideas as a threat versus something to engage with and something to have a dialogue with, or something to entertain. And when you start to view competing ideas as a threat, you get defensive. You kind of put walls up around your worldview and put walls up around yourselves or your family or your whatever, trying to keep out the threatening influences that you perceive in the other worldviews and the other ways of living that you perceive around you. And it creates this kind of self-segregation. And I think that's really dangerous. And I probably fall in the other category, that it's an important part of education to expose students to a broader set of worldviews, not to be so radically pluralistic or radically subjectivist to say that all views are have equal validity or have equal weight or should be entertained as much as any other, but so you can see that it's not as simple as one worldview versus everything else. That kind of adversarial approach to worldviews, my worldview versus everything else that's not me, I think is really dangerous and has caused a lot of the problems that we see in the world.
Sure.
But people don't agree on this. I think, there are people that perceive the role of education to be to reinforce their worldview that they already accept, and they don't want the outside influences of anything that doesn't fit into that worldview as part of the educational experience. And that's how they think of it as education. I'm pretty critical of that, as you gather from listening to me talk here. But I think it's an interesting question. Here in our own world, we have to face this question. In the 24th century, in Deep Space Nine, they have to face that question. And in Deep Space Nine, they kind of, in a way, I'm impressed that they decided to take on an issue like this, in terms of classroom education in the 24th century. On the other hand, I kind of feel like they dropped the ball. At the end of the day, it's like, oh, well, it's better to have kids going to school than running around the ship, so let's send them to school anyway. and that's kind of the end result that we get in Deep Space Nine. We don't really dwell on it very much, but I think it's a depressing issue because, again, it just speaks to this fundamental question about education. Like, what is the purpose of education? Is the purpose of education to reinforce our worldview we already accept, or is the purpose of education some sort of broader exposure to a broader set of worldviews? And there are conflicting views on that, and there are pros and cons to each approach. I think the danger with the approach that I tend to prefer, this broader approach, is that it can appear pluralistic, like in entertaining worldviews that you don't necessarily agree with. It makes them seem as valid or as acceptable or as entertainable as the worldview that you hold. So it can undercut your ability to criticize and think critically about the other ways of life and other worldviews and other takes on things that you see in the world around you. Because if you have a fairly broad exposure, you go, well, if there's 100 cultures out there and they all seem to be functioning just fine, why is mine any better? I think that's a perfectly natural response when you have broad exposure. And that does not necessarily reinforce critical reflection about the values that you see in any one of those cultures. On the other hand, focusing on one culture to the detriment of any other doesn't necessarily reinforce critical thinking either. So they both seem to have their challenge from a critical thinking standpoint. But here in the real world, that's definitely a question. And what the purpose of education is as it relates to multicultural melting pot environments, and that I can't imagine in the 24th century that ceased to be an issue. We've seen it's been an issue in Deep Space Nine. How did they resolve it? I think. It's interesting because, the Federation in general walks this fine line, right? There are shared Federation values amongst all the Federation worlds, right? There are certain values that they have taken to heart, right? Things like coming together politically, things like exploration, things like tolerance. Mm-hmm. There are certain values that all the Federation worlds to some degree have accepted. And that has created kind of a shared Federation culture amongst those different worlds. On the other hand, any one of those worlds has their competing values and their competing social structures. Sure. And there's a tension between being part of Federation society at large versus versus identifying with your own culture and your own world inside the Star Trek universe. Worf has to deal with this, right? Being raised in raised by human parents and being a Starfleet officer while still culturally identifying as Klingon, that creates an internal tension for him. And I think here in the real world, we've seen those tensions play out. People identifying as a certain culture, but their culture having been largely assimilated into Western culture or American culture. And that creates a kind of personal identity crisis or identity tension for some people. So what does that mean for philosophy of education? I don't have any conclusions to draw about that. It's just that, it is an issue. And I think the greater danger that I see is in people walling themselves off culturally and viewing other people as the enemy or as a threat versus entertaining well, it's almost like people who have embraced that view don't even entertain the notion that there are other worldviews out there. I've seen this happen where it's like there's such a narrow lens that people look at the rest of the world with that they almost forget that not everyone thinks that way, not everyone lives that way, not everyone has approaches life in that way, and then there are people that recognize it but reject it outright, and they don't want to entertain it. And they just kind of view it as a threat, and they wall themselves off in some way. And then there are people that try to engage in some sort of constructive dialogue and live and find a way to navigate in this multicultural environment that we're in. I can't imagine that issue is going to go away. I think what I like about the Star Trek universe, especially Deep Space Nine in this regard, is it identifies the fact that will continue to be an issue. It raises the issue inside Star Trek. It doesn't dwell on it very much, right? It's just a tangent of the overall Deep Space Nine experience, but It does show that this issue is not likely to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, if we do ever make it out there into space and there is a much larger universe out there to explore and to this kind of galactic community to become a part of, we're going to have to revisit a lot of the things that we've learned here on planet Earth in a much larger scale culturally. And I'm certain that there are cultures out there, if there are indeed life on other planets, there are cultures out there that are going to be starkly different in contrast to our own. And so
they'll probably still like podcasts, though.
I'm sure
they
still
will listen to us.
I'm sure they will. But again, that was part of the classroom experience there on Deep Space Nine was, integrating, humans from the Federation and Bajarans, and that were largely to that point a very closed species, a closed society, Ferengi, who really didn't associate with humans. And so, they're all kind of in this melting pot sort of situation. And we actually see Jake and Nog experience some of the tensions of getting to understand one another, at least in a cultural context. And it created some problems between the two of them. And it didn't happen in a classroom situation, but isn't that part of the classroom experience. You get to know people who are different to you. Zachary, that's one of the reasons why I took a promotion and moved my family to the Dallas, Texas area. Like many metropolitan areas, this is an incredible melting pot here, and I wanted my daughter to be able to come and experience a multicultural community where, everyone is from, different parts of the country, different parts of the world. And we just didn't have that where we're from. And it's been a great experience for her to experience, to have relationships with people who are of Asian descent and African American descent, and she's made friends that were from the Middle East and India, and it's been a wonderful learning experience for her to understand a little bit more about different cultures and how she fits into that, and how they fit, and how we all kind of fit together in this beautiful tapestry that is humanity.
I think what I love about the way Deep Space Nine deals with this is that it's really fun to see the humans on the other side of the coin here, right? You could imagine an alternate version of this where the humans are all afraid of the multicultural influence from the Ferengi and the Bajorans and kind of walling themselves off as humans. But I've said this before, that in the Star Trek universe, the alien races are more like actual humans here in the real world. So in that episode of Deep Space Nine, we get to see the Ferengi afraid of the human influence on Ferengi education. We get to see the Bajorans afraid of the human influence on Bajoran education. And it's just fun to see the humans on the other side of that coin. They're all afraid of us versus us afraid of them.
Yes.
And I think, too often the majority groups in the Western world, here in the United States in particular, we're the ones who are kind of afraid of outside influence into our culture. But we forget that there's the other side of the coin, that they're just as afraid of our influence on them as they are on us. And and what that, to me, it just points out that we're all really similar in this regard, that we all have our own view, and we're all afraid of people who don't agree with the same things we agree with, and we tend to try to wall ourselves off, and it's important to overcome that barrier, because if you don't overcome that barrier, we'll never get to what we see in the Star Trek universe, right?
Yeah.
We have to be able to overcome this sort of siloed cultural view and realize that at least we're all part of the same world and we're all in this together. At best, we can find ways to appreciate the differences and embrace and tolerate and embrace the otherness of the other people in the world with us. At best, at worst, we'll at least live together on this planet, and worse than that, I guess, would be, of course, just walling ourselves off altogether. So that's kind of my take on the situation. But Mike, while we're talking about philosophy of education in Star Trek, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about educational technology in Star Trek. We did talk about a couple things. We talked about simulating things on the holodeck. We talked about space iPads, learning stuff on the pad. We get to see Jake, of course, writing his news stories and his fiction stories on his iPad with a pen. It looks like the Apple Pencil with an iPad Pro, right? Of course, it never looks like he's actually writing with it. It looks like he's like pushing buttons. I don't know exactly what he's doing with that little stylus on that pad. I can't quite figure that out. But so in addition to simulating things with holodecks and educational tools like space iPads, we could see a bit more educational technology in Deep Space Nine. I'm actually thinking of that episode Children of Time. Remember where there's the alternate timeline and the crew of the Defiant is stranded in the past and we get to meet their descendants. In that episode, we see an interesting take on educational technology with Quark being set up as a digital school teacher, basically functioning very much like a contemporary here in the real world educational technology program. Like, oftentimes our educational technology is very Socratic, right? A student will sit there at the computer and the computer will say, here's a question for you, blah, blah, blah. And it'll ask you a question. It'll be multiple choice or it'll be fill in the blank or whatever. And then you'll try to answer. And if you get it right, it'll go, yay, you got it right. You did a good job. And if you get it wrong, it'll go, you're wrong. And it'll tell you you're wrong. And if it's a good program, it'll say why you're right or why you're wrong and give you some helpful feedback and give you some instruction. And that's what real education is like here in the real world. Like when I was a teacher, if a student came to my office hours, I would kind of ask them a few questions to see where they were at with some things and maybe make them do an activity, do a logic proof or whatever. If they were struggling with a concept, we'd kind of talk about it a little bit. I'd write some things on the board, ask them some questions, and then I'd try to drill down into the heart of where they were stuck. And then I'd try to explain, like, here's the right way to think about it. Here's the right way to do that. that proof. Let's try another one. It would be very Socratic, kind of back and forth, getting them to hone in on better understanding, and hopefully they'd walk away and really understanding something. And we get to see Quark doing that in the guise of educational technology. For these alternate timeline school children, he's the Socratic questioner who's saying, what is the square root of blah, blah, blah? And a student would give an answer and you go, that's not correct, student. Here's the right way to think about it. And we just get to see Quark as this friendly Socratic, educational technology school teacher. That kind of is a very contemporary way of thinking about it. Just, this sort of Socratic question and answer, multiple choice questions with some feedback kind of approach to educational technology. It's very common. I used to write homework content like that. Most everyone writes homework content like that. I sometimes I feel like it's not the most inspired, it's not as engaging as, making the students do square roots or do activities, right? It's still very kind of question and answer, multiple choicey, but it's very much, I feel like that example in Deep Space Nine is very much a child of how we think of education these days. Like, here's your multiple choice test. How did you do? You did great, or you didn't do great. And here's some helpful feedback if you didn't do great. Now go learn something and do better next time. I feel like that itself is not a very inspired approach to education. Like simulating is better than that, and actually doing the apprenticeships that you described are better than that, I think. Wesley actually serving on the bridge of the Enterprise is a better educational experience than, answering Quark's multiple choice square root questions. but so those are the examples I came up with. Are there other just clear examples of educational technology at use inside Star Trek that I'm overlooking?
there is. And as a matter of fact, in both The Next Generation and in Deep Space Nine, and the particular Deep Space Nine episode I'm thinking of is from the first season. It's the episode The Negus. We actually see the students in the classrooms sitting at their desks. Now, Zachary, what I find interesting is that the desks that they're using in the classroom are integrated into the computer system.
Oh, yeah.
So
they're computer terminals, right?
Yeah, Keiko's there as a very, traditional type of, teacher standing in a classroom teaching her students, but the students are interacting with the technology that's in the classroom, the screen, and, they're able to interact via these terminals that are integrated into their desks. So I think that's very interesting. When I was going to school, the desk was basically a solid surface to write on.
Yeah,
it was a writing
your
instrument.
papers on, right?
Exactly. And matter of fact, when I was really young in elementary school, our desks still had holes in them for the inkwells. For pens. Yes.
Wow, you're old.
Yes, I'm old. So, for me, Zachary, to see, these
you're over the halfway
mark.
I'm still under the halfway mark.
Yeah, I'm past that, pal. But to see these desks that are integrated into, the technology of the classroom, I think that's really interesting and a great example. And that's very much the same thing that we see in The Next Generation. So we have to assume that during this time that's pretty much the way a classroom is set up.
That's an interesting thing to focus on, the actual physical desk setup, because there are so many assumptions built into that setup, right? The 1990s Star Trek, late 80s, early 90s, was right on the cusp of the prominence of the internet, right? So the concept of a mobile device being connected in some global network or intergalactic network in the 24th century hadn't quite gelled yet, because we hadn't seen anything quite like that in the real world. That was still very science fiction-y, even as late as the early 90s, right? That wasn't something that was real here in the real world yet. At least it wasn't culturally prominent like it became in the late 90s. And it's amazing how fast that transition occurred from pre-internet to internet existing, right? Now, if you were developing that, you'd say, oh, of course they're all walking around with their mobile devices. And of course they're all connected to not just the computer core, but they're connected to the Federation's version of the internet, right? Obviously, that wasn't obvious in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's funny because I think you're referencing an episode of The Next Generation. It might even be... Is it Rascals?
It's Rascals.
It's Rascals. We're referring to Rascals again, right? Where there's this little toy computer. It's not a mobile device, but it's integrated into the desk. Mm-hmm. But it's an isolated computer terminal that's not connected to the main computer, right? Yes. And that's just such a weird idea. Wait, there's a computer and it's not a mobile device and it's not connected to the main computer core? What? I mean, that was a normal thing to envision, back in the
it's kind of like
early
a
90s.
24th century My Simon. You remember the little My Simon computers.
Totally, or Speak and Spell, or the little My Professor calculator, or but it's like, wait, you have a computer that's not connected to anything? Like, that's just such. I think our assumptions about what a computer would be like have changed from then to now. Now, if you were designing it, you'd go, well, it wouldn't be integrated into the desk because that kind of sucks. It's not mobile; you can't carry it around, and it wouldn't just be this isolated thing that's not connected to anything because that's kind of stupid and not useful. And it's funny because they do kind of make fun of it inside the episode, like, oh, this is just a baby computer. It's a toy computer. It's not connected to anything.
Yeah, Picard's just a little irritated over that. Child, little Picard.
He's like, first thing I do when I get back to full size, I'm gonna give these kids some internet. It's also very individualistic. Like the idea of a student having his or her own desk with a computer built into it is an interesting idea. I think now, of course, we would make it a mobile device if we were designing this again. It wouldn't be integrated into the desk. That's not very useful, really. But also it just reinforces this idea that education is an individual thing versus a communal thing. And I think, again, this is a fundamental tension in education, right? If you're an individualist, it's like you do your studying and you do your homework and you show up and answer your questions, and it's not related to what any of the other students are doing, right? Versus education as more of a communal learning experience, group projects and group activities and whatnot. I've always probably personally been more on the individualistic side. I'd rather just do my own work and get my tasks done and do my studying and take my exams and go home and do my own things. That's how I roll. But some people really are more communalist, where they like group activities and group experiences and group projects and group presentations. And I just think it's interesting that this idea of a computer terminal built into a single desk kind of reinforces this individualist model of education versus what is probably a bit more contemporary, the more communal model of education.
It seems strange to me that, because we live in an era of interactive smart boards and wireless technology in the classroom. I mean, literally, students in the classroom have iPads that interact with the smart boards that are in there wirelessly. I mean, I come from the age of chalkboards, and you probably come from more, whiteboards were probably a little bit more common.
I don't know. When I was teaching logic, I would use chalk. I would bring that multicolored chalk in, the rainbow colored chalks.
Yes.
And I would bring that in. I would use these ginormous actual chalkboards inside these lecture halls. And I would do it old school and get my hands dirty and teach those kids logic, but get my hands dirty while doing it.
Yeah.
No whiteboards for me. I'm all about the chalk.
But, again, we come from, we're living the age now of interactive smart. I mean, there are no chalkboards in classrooms. They have smart boards, and the kids have...
It depends where you're at. And
iPads.
In all fairness, it really does depend on the socioeconomic status and what's going on in that region, whether you can afford those kinds of things or not, right? But...
Well, I know even in West Virginia when I was living there, I mean, smart boards 3 years ago were starting to pop up in classrooms, and the socioeconomic situation in West Virginia is not the greatest, and so that technology is even making its way there. So and here in Dallas, Texas, it's very common. Kids are literally being issued iPads at schools, and those iPads, they connect wirelessly and can interact with those smart boards. So to some degree, now again, we have to realize that for Deep Space Nine, you're talking the 1990s. This idea that they were sitting at basically little mini computer terminals that were their desks that were able to interact with the technology in the room was incredible, but it seems a little bit behind the times even now.
This is something I really don't know because I don't have children, so I don't see the day-to-day interaction with kids and technology, but I wonder what growing up with this technology is like. For me, not having this technology, I grew up with the Atari 2600 and my Texas Instruments TI-99 4A computer, and they weren't connected to anything, but I could write some programs in BASIC, and I could play some computer games and some educational games. Some really brilliant work was done in the early 80s on educational technology games, or what they called edutainment back in the day. It was the buzzword from 30 years ago. But there was some brilliant stuff that was done, but it's nothing like what we have now, where everything is integrated and there's such easy access to technology, such easy access to any information you want. Like, having to go to a library and do actual research that was part of what we did, right? We used,
Exactly.
we pulled out the card catalogs and flipped through the pages and went to find the books and maybe asked the librarian for some help. And we had to do those things. You don't really have to do those things anymore. You can find all the information you want from your tablet or from your smartphone, right?
You Google it.
I'm interested not so much in the virtues or non-virtues of those. I'm interested in the culture behind it. Like for me, those things still seem magical because I didn't grow up with them. And I look at my smartphone and my tablet and I go, these are like magic tablets. They give me access to the entire world, anything I want to know, things I can make. It's like a tool that is just magical, tome of information that I can just open up and boom, there's the answer to anything I want. It's amazing. Like that, I would have killed for something like that 30 years ago. And here it is. We all have them, right? And, but kids that grow up with them, with tools like that, with this educational technology or devices, is it magical or is it just the norm? And if it's the norm, what does that mean? Just view the world as totally integrated in that way. For me, I didn't have to acculturate. I kind of grew up with it. I was a teenager when the internet came into prominence, so I didn't really have to learn it. I just kind of evolved along with it. But, people who were older than I had to learn it. People who are younger than I am grew up with it. It's part of their worldview. What does it mean to view the world as so integrated that information is not something you have to work for? Information is just there, and it's part of the world around you in a deeply integrated way.
It's fascinating to me, Zachary, that as little as we see of education in the Star Trek universe, we really have examples of varying types of educational experiences. We've already talked about the classroom, the integration of technology within the classroom. We've seen different examples of classrooms, I think, in the Next Generation where, you have families that are living there on the ships and they probably have age-appropriate classrooms on Deep Space Nine. That's kind of the frontier. So we have something that looks more like the one-room school situation that you maybe would have seen in the West during the 1800s, early 1900s, where you have a single classroom and students of varying ages. And I think that there are some pros and cons to that. We could sit here all day and debate those pros and cons. I certainly think one of the pros, my daughter is a part of an organization called American Heritage Girls, and they place a great emphasis on the value of the older girls who mentor the younger girls. And I think that there's some value in that for both the younger children and the older children. But again, those values within the classroom situation, I think, are debatable. I think an implied educational model that we see within the Star Trek universe is the homeschool situation. What happens when on Deep Space Nine when the classroom is closed down? Keiko shuts the school down. Because of lack of interest, maybe her own lack of interest. We're never really sure. I mean, the war was kind of brewing, and people were leaving the station, and children weren't really coming to class. That was sort of what we were presented.
It was closed as a result of a bomb once, wasn't it?
It was closed as a result of a bomb at the end of season 1.
How relevant is that?
But they persisted. But what happens to Jake and to Nog after that? And I think what we see, I think what's implied, and then I think to some degree for Wesley Crusher as well, what's implied is more of a homeschool situation where their education is really self-driven and probably monitored much more closely by their parents. And in our own culture, in our own society today, that is becoming more and more popular. As we kind of move through time here, we've had this kind of uptick of charter schools. Matter of fact, I heard a commercial for a charter school today where their emphasis is on character and that's kind of what they're advertising. We're a character-driven education.
Is that now? Let me ask you a serious question. Is that code for we wall ourselves off and we teach our values and no one else's, or is that...
that's interesting because I wondered as I listened to that commercial, what exactly does that mean? Again, here in the Dallas area, we have charter schools that are very college preparatory driven. Their goal. For the students who go to school there, their goal is to prepare them really for top, not community colleges, Zachary, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with community colleges, but the goal is to prepare those students for top-notch college education experiences. You know, they boast in the fact that their students go to Yale and to Harvard, and
they can study under Data at Cambridge since Data holds the Location chair.
Exactly. And I know that there are schools that emphasize the arts, music, drama, whatnot. There are charter schools where that's more their focus. They like in Jake's case, in the Star Trek universe, he was going to a school that kind of focused on writing, and we see that in our own universe. But I think that it's fascinating that there's kind of an implied homeschool situation there. Again, it's becoming more popular as we move along here, and that was a choice that we made for ourselves. So in the Star Trek universe, they closed the school down on Deep Space Nine. So I think it's implied there that Jake is receiving a homeschool education. There are lots of ways in our own world to get a homeschool education. That you can go out and you can purchase materials. You can do school online. Now it's completely free here in the state of Texas. You can get the same curriculum and materials that are available in most public schools. You can get it online. You have access to teachers for support. It's really incredible what's available out there, for homeschooling parents. I imagine, in the future, in the 24th century, Jake on his, personal access devices pad, he could probably, tap into a lecture. He could Quark speak and spell.
Quark speak and spell. Well, you're hitting on something interesting because, I would have been, had we had things like iPads and this radical interconnectivity, that would have fed my introverted nature as a younger person, right? I would have loved being able to sit there with my little iPad and hang out by myself and read my stuff and do my homework and just kind of wall myself off in that way, because that's kind of my temperament. In a way, culturally, in the world around me, this is still an ongoing source of frustration for me. I feel like the extroverts have won in a way. Like everyone is expected to be so performative and so expressive and have something to say all the time. And even though I'm a podcaster and I do talk a lot, it's actually really, really exhausting. And fundamentally, I'm a quiet, more introverted person. And there's this tension that I see where as educational technology improves to the point where you can really get a robust educational experience on your own, whether in a homeschool or as an individual study or whatever, that is at tension with our more extroverted cultural values, where we want group activities and lots of presentations and everyone always having something to say all the time. That quiet, more introspective, contemplative approach to education that's more individualistic is at odds with the culture of group education that I see around, and culturally, and frankly, just the culture of being loud and expressive. I think there's just culturally, I see expressiveness and loudness everywhere I go these days. I prefer the sort of more individualistic, quiet, contemplative approach because that's my personality. And every time I'm forced to do a group activity or a group fill in the blank, I'm not excited about it, honestly. I find those experiences stressful and not terribly satisfying, and I would rather just do my own work and do my own activities and learn things on my own. And that's where I feel like I'm the best version of myself. Although, I've cultivated being able to do those things. I was a teacher and I've talked to hundreds of students at a time, and I've led seminars and I've led meetings, and I've had to be able to make myself do those things, and I'm even good at those things. I just don't necessarily enjoy them like other more extroverted people do. So I just wonder how they reconcile the idea that you can learn everything you need to learn in a homeschool or an individual study in the Star Trek universe, like with your pad or with your computer terminal or with your whatever, with your holodeck experience, whatever. With the need to function as in a group, as a collective, as 7 of 9 would say, as a collective. Right. Those values are at odds with each other in my mind. And I think that tension gets worse as educational technology gets better, because that technology can reinforce the introverted nature of introverted people. And the fact that everything's so interconnected can reinforce the extroverted nature for extroverted people. And that tension has only gotten worse as technology's improved, as I see it.
But yeah, I think it's interesting that we see examples of just about every kind of educational model internships. We kind of talked about this, internships in classrooms and homeschools, and it's really fascinating that, at least in the mind of the Star Trek creators and writers, that there's a good possibility that variety will persist when it comes to education philosophy in the future.
Well, I guess for me, Mike, in the way of final thought, since we've been talking for well over an hour, I fundamentally have this conviction that education is just not very complicated. You get a little exposure to some information, you get some practice doing whatever you need practice doing, you get some feedback if you're struggling, you rinse, repeat a couple times, and you've learned whatever you need to learn, and off you go. I just don't think of that as very complicated. What I see in the world around me, whether it's in the corporate world or whether it's in the public sphere or just popular thinking about education in general, I see massive groupthink about education. People coming up with crazy ideas for stuff everyone needs to do, people coming up with all kinds of rules and standards that may or may not be helpful. I see, extroverts run rampant, squashing the tender souls of the introverts around them. I just see people making education way more complicated than it needs to be. I fundamentally think it's just not that hard to learn. It's not easy. It's not like it's not a struggle. It's a struggle to really learn something deeply, but it's not complicated, right? If you learn by doing and you get access to some information and you get feedback and you do that a few times, most people are going to thrive in that situation in one way or another, at different rates and on different subject areas. But fundamentally, I think it all boils down to something approximating that. I don't think it's very complicated. But and I'm curious because this is the late 70s, early 80s version of myself talking, but I still find appealing the sort of techno-utopian vision of what education could be. This free access to information makes it easy to learn anything you need to learn. It's so cheap to produce and get access to those kinds of materials that, access to education gets increased and costs go down and we make the world a better place for all of us, right? I still kind of think that's a very appealing vision. I think the last 30 or 40 years of educational technology has not seen that come to fruition to the degree that it was predicted in the late 70s and early 80s. And yet we grew up in the 80s and 90s with the Star Trek vision of the future where, we do have this, information heavy society, a technological society, a tolerant society, and clearly education played a role in getting to that vision of the future. And it's hard to discern from the examples we see in the Star Trek universe of what exactly that means and how exactly that works, because all of the issues we've identified here in the real world seem to be mirrored in some way in the Star Trek universe, or at least referred to in some way. So clearly there's been progress, but some of those issues are still issues. So how have they resolved all of that to improve the educational experiences? Because hell, in the 24th century, kids are learning calculus, right? So they must have improved something along the way. But how exactly did they get that far? And how did they solve some of these fundamental issues in education that we've talked about to yield a better educational experience that produces a better society that we see in the 23rd and 24th century? We don't have the answers because we don't get enough information inside the Star Trek universe to really connect all the dots and see how everything fits together. But again, my totally subjective, take on things that education doesn't need to be as complicated as it is, and that the easy access to information that we have here in this very magical 21st century, again, from my late 20th century perspective, this is a very magical early 20th century. We should have made further progress along all of these lines, given that we have solved the access to information problem that was so problematic in the early and mid part of the 20th century, right? Having to go scour card catalogs and scan through microfiche to find information. That's the world we grew up in, right? The educational world is better than that, but how come we haven't made as much progress on these lines as we should have? And more importantly, how can we just get people to embrace ownership of their own educational experience and by extension, ownership of the quality of the work that they produce and whatever they end up doing in their lives? Because education is just a step along the journey, right? You do your classroom experience or your online, educational experience. You get a job. You're still learning new skills while you're working. You live the rest of your life, and ultimately, at the end of the day, it has to mean something. So I just worry that we've become so specialized, almost like that episode of The Next Generation, the Masterpiece Society,
yes,
where everyone is so specialized that they have forgotten what it means to be human and live with the unknown and live with the uncertainty of not being able to predict the future or understand what it all means. I just worry that we are weeding out the internal tensions that make for a richer human experience, insofar as, pardon the phrase, life hack the educational experience and life hack our careers and life hack all the uncertainty out of life. I worry that we are weeding out some of the things that really do define us as a species and as people. And if that's the case, I hope I don't live to see the day where that actually comes to fruition. I think that's really sad if that happens.
Yeah. And my gracious, Zachary, I didn't take calculus until my junior year of high school, so...
and you're smarter than I am. I had to do it as a senior, so there you go.
That was actually calculus 2. Thank you very much. Grueling experience, I have to say. But I think it's fascinating, and I think you're right to some degree. I mean, read, rinse, and repeat. That's kind of education in a nutshell. But I think it goes a step beyond that. I think there's a lot of doing that needs to happen as well. As I said at the top of the podcast, I'm very much a proponent of work, hard work. I think that most people learn by doing, and again, I love the fact that we see this really modeled in the Star Trek universe. And I think as we move forward, I think information and technology, I think, are going to play a big part in education and in educational philosophy going forward. I think we're going to see technology play a bigger part. And as the internet becomes even more packed with information than it already is, I think we'll see walls break down. I don't know that the whole remuneration piece will completely come out of the puzzle, but I do foresee those walls kind of coming down, and I think we see that in the Star Trek universe. So as we see that happen, as we see more and more information become available, free, with easy access through incredible technologies, some of which I don't even think we've even imagined at this point. I think the one thing that will never change is the actual doing. And again, I love that we see that in the Star Trek universe where. And quite frankly, I'm surprised that we don't see more use of the holodeck in the educational experience, because...
Yeah, who needs a field trip? You can just go to the holodeck.
Yeah, exactly. I mean...
That's what a field trip is on the Enterprise, right?
We see the Doctor create the Krell-Moset program in order
that's a rich educational experience. That's a simulated surgery, right? I mean, that's medical training right there.
Yeah, exactly. So, And they do simulations in the Star Trek. We hear them say all the time, we ran simulations and this was the result.
Yeah, we blew up Voyager, 20 times, right?
That's an educational experience. So, quite frankly, I do see, because we are making strides towards being able to create virtual worlds around us. And it's all fun and games now. I mean, kids are running around with the virtual reality goggles, chasing Pokemons. But I think,
I think you might have sounded older there than you meant to. Kids these days with their Pokemons and virtual reality headsets.
But honestly, Zachary, I think we're going to find ways to use this technology to enrich the educational experience. I mean, I believe that there's going to come a day when we're not necessarily going to stop chasing Pokemons, but we're going to find ways to use this technology to enrich people's lives, to enrich their experiences, to teach them more about the world around them, to give them opportunities to try and fail where the stakes aren't so high. I mean, with a surgeon now, you go in and you watch and then you do, and the stakes are high. I mean, when you've got a scalpel in your hand and you've got a living, breathing human being laying there on the table, the stakes couldn't be higher. So to be able to give them a true simulated experience where they're experiencing it with every sense And if they fail, it's okay. Again, we'll rinse and repeat. We'll do this again until we get it right. And then we'll take that experience into real life.
Yeah, you want the stakes to be lower when you're first learning to do surgery.
Yeah, exactly. I see that being the future of education. And frankly, I'm surprised that we didn't see that more in the Star Trek universe, because I think once we get to the 24th century, I think it's going to be a norm.
I just wonder, in the 24th century, do you think they will still actually teach Latin? I took Latin in school for about 2.5 years, and it was one of the most valuable things I did. It got me paying attention to language more than I ever did in all my English classes and all the rest of my educational experience. And it got me thinking in terms of structure and thinking in terms of phrasing and, thinking in terms of grand themes as you're reading classic literature. I think it was one of the most valuable things I ever did. I love this idea that even in the 24th century, they will still find some value in teaching Latin to Starfleet cadets.
To answer your question, I do think they'll teach Latin, but if they're teaching calculus to elementary age kids, then I can only
Why aren't they
imagine.
teaching Latin sooner?
We wait until they go off to college.
Yeah, they used to start with Latin and teach them calculus later. They flipped it in the 21st century. Now they teach calculus in kindergarten, and they teach Latin at graduate school.
Well, Zachary, it's been fun talking about the future of philosophy and education, especially in the Star Trek universe, but that isn't the only thing that we've been discussing on the network. So here's a quick look, everyone, at some other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, the 602 Club.
I just love that idea that wars aren't just won by the soldiers there, they're won by everybody at home doing everything that's possible. And here it literally meant that they had to go and risk their lives to make sure that happened. And it was just I think it was just something really beautiful in that picture, that salvation would come from fishermen.
To the journey!
They do this incredible job of double bluffing you about which ship's going to make it, and
because you're thinking it's the one that's pretty much intact and good. No, here's the Vidians.
And honestly, I think that's the reason it didn't make my list, is that I love the way they end the episode, and there's this period in the middle of the episode where I actually kind of get bored. Like, something kind of dies in the middle of the episode, and then it gets really interesting again at the end, and then they pull the... Yeah.
Warp 5.
I just thought, those are where, of course, some of the other Enterprise references come up. He was a Mako. He fought in the Zindian-Romulan Wars. I really like that background and that tie-in. And it makes sense that, over the course of 100 years, that somebody's going to kind of go a little crazy and get to this point where they're just, seething for some kind of revenge or something. So,
and introducing The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
What have you done out there on the edge of Federation space?
Welcome to The Edge, Trek FM's brand new podcast where we dive into the final frontier of the newest Star Trek series, Star Trek Discovery, the first Star Trek series to be on air in 12 and a half years, something like that.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these and any of the shows on the network and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. That helps us out tremendously. If you're not an Apple user, no worries, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most third-party apps. And you can always stream and download the MP3 file from our website and grab the RSS link as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to share your thoughts with us. The best place to join the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners-only group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. It's a closed group, but if you click to join, one of our admins will let you right on in. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the contact form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Just choose message to a Trek FM show and select Metatreks. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM is our handle, and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. Well, Zachary, when you're not blazing into the educational unknown, where can our listeners find you around the network and on the interwebs?
Well, you can find me elsewhere on Trek.fm as co-host of To the Journey, Trek FM's show dedicated to all things Star Trek Voyager, along with my two co-hosts over there, Kay Shaw and Suzanne Williamson. You can find me in the Babel Conference if you'd like to talk about Star Trek and philosophy with me there, and you can always find me on Twitter. My handle is just my name, at Zachary Fruhling. That's Zachary, Z-A-C-H-A-R-Y, Fruhling, F-R-U-H-L-I-N-G. And Mike, when you're not practicing open heart surgery on the holodeck, where can our listeners find you on the interwebs and around? Hold on, let me do that again. I kind of messed it up. And Mike, when you're not practicing open heart surgery on the holodeck, where can our listeners find you on the interwebs and around the Trek FM network?
Well, Zachary, when I'm not carving into some simulated left atrium, you can find me on Facebook. That's where I spend most of my time on social media, although I'm pretty active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at cmichael1701. I'm occasionally on Instagram, cmichael1701. And if you'd like to read my blog about my journey to publish my novel and a little bit about life, you can catch that at cmichael1701.wordpress.com. Well, if you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. There are many perks, which include things like early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, all available on our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of time and money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us. Hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Well, Zachary, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Metatrex team from around the network. Specifically, we'd like to thank C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek.fm, our executive producers, Matthew Rushing and Ken Tripp, Aaron Harvey, our art director, our production manager, Richard Marquez, our Patreon manager, Brandon Shea Mutala. We'd also like to give a big shout out to our associate producers here on Metatrex. We'd like to thank Patrick Devlin. You can connect with him on Twitter. His Twitter handle is at MagicDrop5. Kay Shaw, your co-host over on To the Journey. Her Twitter handle is at Choco Weeble. And Norman Lau, his Twitter handle is at Starfighter1701. We just want to say thank you so much for all that you do to keep Metatrex coming each week. And we want to mention our sponsors. Don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and to get your seat on the mission. And check out Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/TrekFM. Well, thanks everyone for listening to Metatrex, a Star Trek and Philosophy podcast. Until next time, when we will once again boldly go where no philosophers have gone before.